Okay, so thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor for me to be here. I love Amsterdam, so it was even especially wonderful to be able to come here. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So, as Nora said, bounded choice is my theory about sort of what happens to people when they're in cults, or what we sometimes call high control groups or high demand groups, that people on the outside see people believing or doing things that seem completely incomprehensible to them. And so what I tried to do, this is actually based on my Ph.D. research when I was a student like some of you are, trying to answer that question. And it was always important for me because I myself was in an extremist group. It was a left-wing political group, and we were going to make the revolution. And so when I got out of that organization after 10 and a half years, and I was 41 years old, and I felt like I was 15, and I tried to figure out what the hell had happened to me because I had turned into a really nasty human being. I went to New York and luckily got myself help. And it took me 10 years to decide to go to grad school. I had already had a college degree. I joined when I was 31, so I already had a BA with honors from the University of Wisconsin. I'd had a Fulbright fellowship. I'd lived in Europe. I'd done a lot of stuff. So I wasn't a kid when I got recruited into that group. Some people think it's naive people who join these things. Anyway, so when I got out, I was like trying to figure out what the hell, and it took me very early on. I thought, okay, I want to go to grad school. I didn't know what I was going to do exactly, but it took 10 years to actually get to the point where I felt like I could do it, that I was good enough to do it. Because part of what happens to you when you're in these organizations is the loss of sense of self and the loss of self-esteem and self-trust. So I would go as far as getting a catalog and looking through it, and then I go, no, there's no way I can ever do that, And even when I was in grad school, I would call up my advisor crying and say, I can't do this, and he'd say, Janja, just get back to work, So anyway, just wanted to share a little bit of my background so you know where I'm coming from. So Naomi, who invited me, asked me to speak about accountability and responsibility, so that's something I'm happy to do. So these are, 4 incidents going back some years where we saw the kind of violence that can come from these kinds of groups. I imagine you're familiar with most of these, and obviously the Kenya death cult just happened very recently, where hundreds of people have died. Waco, I'm sure you're familiar with. Jonestown, which was the first really big event that sort of Americans woke up. And of course, one of the problems with what happened at Jonestown is most people, for many years at least, most people thought every cult was going to end up like that. And so it takes a long time to sometimes convince people not every cult is going to become a Jonestown, but there are other issues that are important, that are relevant. And that was the sarin gas attack in Tokyo. So just to give you a little bit of my definition of how I view this word cult, which I know is controversial, but I feel very strongly about using that word because I feel like, we call a gang, so let's call a cult a cult. It has a meaning, it has a history, and I know there are people called cult apologists who like to call them new religious movements, but I wasn't in a new religious movement, so hey, how does that work? So for me, it's a group that's held together by a shared commitment to a charismatic leader, and I'll talk more about that. It upholds what I call a transcendent belief system that includes a recipe for personal transformation, and that's the very important part of that. And finally, it requires a high level of commitment in words and deeds. So that's kind of a actually rather neutral definition. In terms of the belief system, why I call it a transcendent belief system is that I believe these groups are offering you a belief system that gives you the answer to everything, the past, the present, and the future, so that it becomes your whole new worldview, your view of your past, your view of the present, your view of what you hope for, what salvation they are offering you. And the very important part included in that is that you must go through a personal transformation in order to remain on that path. You don't just join a church or join a group and you are who you are. You are required to change. And that's the indoctrination process. So my bounded choice theory includes these four concepts of the charismatic authority, the transcendent belief system, the systems of control, and the systems of influence. And this is the individual here in the middle. So you're enveloped in what I call a self-sealing system. And each of those aspects has kind of a dualistic feature, meaning that you both love the leader and you fear the leader, right? You never know if it's the nice, wonderful leader who's going to turn up or the monster who's going to cause some kind of uproar or criticize someone or do whatever. With the belief system, you have found purpose. We have this idea that it's only seekers who get involved in these groups, and there's kind of this stigmatism about the word seeker. Oh, you must be a seeker. Well, in my opinion, we're all seekers. We all want meaning, we all want understanding, we all want a framework for understanding the world. And so with this, you have found that purpose. But the other side of that is you have to make this extreme commitment, right? You don't just say, oh yeah, I believe in this. You gotta then do something about it. The systems of control and the systems of influence, obviously I don't mean this mechanically, they're sociological terms. The systems of control are the very obvious sort of rules and regulations, right? It's maybe it's what you wear, where you live, who you marry, how many kids you have or don't have, the very, very obvious rules. And they provide both a sense of duty, but also guilt, because you can never do good enough. And you're told that over and over, you're never going to do good enough. So, in my opinion, the systems of control are certainly important, but far more important are what I call the systems of influence. And this is the social psychological manipulation that goes on. And this is where basically the cult, the leader, or your particular leadership, they know how to prey on your emotions. So they're using love and fear and guilt and shame and blame and all of those things that most of us have learned to respond to all our lives, unless we grow up in that group, and then that's a different story, which Guinevere speaks very plainly about. I love that you had Guinevere Turner's book there. She actually works with our nonprofit. So that's wonderful. So the systems of influence give you this sense of identification. This is where you're really being reshaped or molded into who the cult wants you to be. But the flip side of that is that you have to wholly 100% internalize that. And that is what we will see leads to this sense of bounded choice. So first of all, what cults or whatever you want to call these groups are about is conformity. And everything is done to get you to be the perfect little cult member, the perfect follower. And there's 5 steps included in that, which is recruitment, indoctrination, the change process, the reinforcement of that change, and then finally you're in this closed loop of the self-sealing system. And the goal for the cult is to create deployable agents. And not every person in a cult is going to get to that place, and that's okay. They just need enough deployable agents that they can accomplish whatever it is they want to accomplish. So there will be in every group people at different levels. In the group I was in, we had the cadre level. We were the 100%. This is what we did with our lives. This is what we vowed to die for. And then we had what were called general members. and they were hardly members at all. And then we had new members, and then we had rank and file, and then, we had middle level leadership, higher level leadership, and most groups will have that kind of hierarchy that builds up. And that's why when people leave these groups, some people will have a very different experience than other people. For example, in my case, I was always in top leadership. I was in the inner circle. I knew all the crap that went on all the time. And when I left, I had a lot of stories to tell. And people who were rank and file, who had, this nice little experience helping get out the vote or whatever we were doing at the public level, they had a grand old time, and they were like, oh, she must be exaggerating, that never went on. They didn't have a clue what went on in the inner circle or in the headquarters. So I think that explains why some people, and this is a lot what I call the cult apologists use, they say, oh, well, these people are just these disgruntled former members telling these extreme stories. No, people tell real stories about what happens in these groups. So I'll go over this a little bit. I want to get some water. Is that okay? Or if you'll get it, that'd be great. So far, so good. I haven't coughed yet. Thank you. I'm actually quite nervous, which is unusual. I guess because I'm in Amsterdam. Okay, so recruitment, I'm sure you're all kind of familiar with this given the work that you're doing, but the point of recruitment is compliance, get you to go along, commitment, get you to come back to the next thing, and this idea of charisma, get you to think it's special, right? So, and as it says here, 66% are recruited by friends, family, or a coworker, which means you're typically invited to something by someone you know, and it's harder to say no to someone you know. So it might be your coworker who's like, oh, come to this self-improvement workshop, it's gonna be so great. No, I can't tell you what goes on there, you have to find out. And you get so tired of this person badgering you all the time, finally you say, okay, I'll go. Well, once you go, what are they gonna do? Who knows the expression? When you get to that first thing, what are they gonna do? Anybody know? Love bombing. We call it love bombing. So when you get there, they're gonna make you feel so special, right? They know you're the new person, or maybe there's 10 of you. You're gonna be surrounded, they're gonna make you feel like you're the most brilliant person in the world, or the most beautiful, or the most whatever, and they're gonna just, shower you with praise, and they make you feel so good that even if you don't want to, and this is, I don't know if you're familiar with Cialdini, Robert Cialdini, and his influence principles, or persuasion principles. Oh, he's great, Robert Cialdini, Cialdini. So then you feel obligated because they've made you feel so good. So even if you don't want to come back, you say, okay, I'll come back again, right? So it's this sense of obligation, and that's the purpose. We used to do these big dinners, like at Thanksgiving, we'd do these big turkey dinners. We'd have like 20 turkeys, right? And then the workers were going to come, like we were trying to recruit workers. So we all had to make sure we dressed like workers and pretend we were workers if we weren't working at a job, and we'd have this house with 15 turkeys and all this food, and maybe 3 workers would come. It was just like, oh my God. Or we'd have picnics, and it was all just to recruit and make people feel like, oh, what a happy bunch of people, they're singing, they're this and that. And that's how it works. So they get you to come back, and they get you to think it's special. And they'll often tell you, oh, you must come, Guru Baba Wawa is coming, and he's going to sit in a chair, and he's going to rise up off the chair, and there's going to be a yellow light around him, and you're going to see this yellow light, and you go to this thing, you take off your shoes when you end, and everybody's sitting there, and Guru Baba Baba comes out, and everybody's going, oh my God, the yellow light, and you don't see a fucking light. You're like, where's the yellow light? But because everyone else sees the light, you say, oh yeah, there's the yellow light, This is a group influence, the pressure, the peer pressure. And some of you will say, no yellow light, I'm out of here. All I need is that one person to say, 1 or 2, and they've got you. So that's recruitment. The indoctrination, you know, a lot of people think the indoctrination is out of the Manchurian Candidate. You know, they sit you in a room, they shave your head, they drip water on your head, and they torture you and all of that. That's really not what it is. I get a lot of parents calling me, right, and they'll say, oh, my daughter must be on drugs, you know, she's got this like look in her eyes and she doesn't sound the same, they must be drugging her. Most cults don't use drugs. Some did, Charles Manson did, some did, but they don't have to. They're using basic social psychology, basic persuasion techniques to get you to change. And as I said earlier, guilt, anxiety, fear, love, shame, the peer pressure of the group process. And I guess that's why cults are groups, because the peer pressure is very important. As you know, after a certain age, we're much more influenced by our peers than, say, our parents or other adults. So being in that group setting where you know you're being watched, you're watching everyone else, you know people are reporting on each other, you're writing security reports, you know all that, you're going to behave, right? That's all you can do. They offer you this promise of salvation, whether that's enlightenment, whether it's political, whether it's making a lot of money with a multi-marketing scheme, whatever that salvation is, they're going to bring it to you, and only this person can bring it to you, right? You've got to stay on that path. And you feel like you're part of a new family. And of course, that's another very human phenomenon. We're social animals, right? We all want to feel like we're part of something, unless we're the Unabomber. I think he's the only guy who lived in a cabin and blew things up, but there's very few people actually like that. So, any questions so far? No? Okay. So, the change process. Does anybody know who this is? This is my European audience. You do?
It's the guy who kidnapped Elizabeth Smart. I can't remember.
Pardon?
He kidnapped Elizabeth Smart.
Elizabeth Smart. This is Elizabeth Smart. She was the young Mormon girl who was kidnapped out of her bedroom by this guy, whose name I can't remember anymore. I'm getting too old. He kidnapped her and was making her one of his wives. He thought he was, the Messiah. He had left I don't know if I should say legitimate Mormon church, but he left the LDS, started his own thing with his wife. His goal was to kidnap 8 women. So he got Elizabeth Smart, who was from a very good family, blah, blah, blah. Started dressing her like this. Initially, they tied her to a tree for days and sexually assaulted her, broke her down. But they would walk her through town. I mean, everybody in the world was looking for Elizabeth Smart. But they'd dress her like this and walk her through town, and nobody would ever recognize her until finally someone did. So this change process, of course, is to give you a new worldview, new attitudes, new behaviors. It all comes together, goes together, and you begin to change from whoever you were before into this new person. And you begin to lose your former interests that had nothing to do with whatever your new belief system is, right? So like I used to play tennis, I was doing Taekwondo, I was doing all these things. Once I joined the cult, I didn't do any of that anymore. I didn't have time. And when I left the cult, 5 years later, I drove by a tennis court and I suddenly remembered. I had completely forgotten. And I suddenly remember, oh my God, I used to play tennis every day. I mean, it's like it wipes out. I mean, that's what happens with memories. If you don't use them, you lose them, right? So when you're in these closed worlds, you begin to lose your former self. And that's why I tell families, if you have someone in a cult, and if you are able to have communication, like send them reminders of life before. Send them their favorite cookies. Send them pictures of, Christmas 10 years ago when you all had such a great time. Send them postcards when you go on vacation and say, wish you were here, whatever. Don't confront them, don't challenge them. Tug at their heartstrings. That's what you want to do. You want to tug at their heartstrings, which will hopefully get their mind working again. And eventually you get molded into how the cult wants you to be, act, and think. And in most groups, when you're a new member, you'll get assigned what might be called a help partner or a discipler in the discipling movement. Or in our group, we had what we call one helps. And this person is like to become your new friend, and you're supposed to tell them everything. So that if you have doubts and hesitation, you say, I don't know, Joe, this seems a little extreme. Well, what's Joe going to do with that? He's going to report it back to the leadership. So in the next meeting, you're going to get criticized for having doubts. And you learn very quickly you don't have those doubts anymore. Well, you do have the doubts. This is my theory, besides bounded choice. Everybody who's in one of these groups has doubts. Even I was the truest of true believers. Top leadership. I had doubts. I saw things that I was like, Jesus Christ, this can't be. I mean, I used to literally say to myself, we're in the tradition of Stalin, and at least we haven't killed anybody yet. That's how I used to rationalize, right? And then one day I was on a trip with our leader in Yugoslavia, and she called back home and told the second in command, have Comrade Ed killed. And in my mind, I was like, oh my fucking God, and I keep swearing, I'm sorry. That's one of the things from the cult I haven't gotten rid of. Anyway, the whole rest of the trip, I was like, when I get home and I'm going to find that Ed is killed. But in fact, I kind of knew. Our leader was a horrific alcoholic. And I thought, okay, Rosa knows that she was drunk. And Rosa's going to know that tomorrow she isn't going to remember that she called Rosa and told her to have Ed killed. And that's typically what happened. But at the moment, it was still terrifying because it was like busting open my one rationalization for carrying on with this. So, I don't know where I went with that. But anyway, they get you to think, act, and behave the way the cult wants you to do. Oh, I was talking about the doubts. So everybody has doubts. And you learn very quickly that you have no way to express those doubts, right? No one to exchange them with, even if you're married or whatever. So you store them on this shelf in the back of your head. So I use this metaphor. And it's the other thing I tell families to do, plant seeds on that shelf. So eventually, one too many things will happen, or you'll see one too many things that you're like, I don't know, and the shelf breaks. Once the shelf breaks, you don't necessarily know you're in a cult or you're in a terrorist organization or ISIS or whatever, but you know it's not right. You know something's not right, and you start to think, maybe this isn't the right thing for me. Maybe this isn't in my best interest. And then hopefully, again, depending on the group, depending how isolated you are you on some compound in the middle of New Mexico, or are you in the middle of San Francisco like we were? Where are you? Do you have any people on the outside? Hopefully, slowly, you will work your way out. You'll find a way to get out. So I think the shelf is really important to understand as outsiders, that it's a way we can help people get that realization, have that wake-up moment. Okay, so reinforcement. Of course, this whole indoctrination process, or what some people like to call brainwashing, I don't use the word brainwashing because it's so controversial. I do believe in brainwashing. I was one of the main brainwashers in the group I was in. I was brainwashed. I know it exists, but it's such a controversial term, again, because of the cult apologists primarily, that I prefer to use indoctrination, or I sometimes use re-socialization as a sociologist. But that process doesn't stick, and so it constantly needs to be reinforced. So while you're in the group, there will be a little bit of carrot, a few nice things. Maybe you get promoted or you get something special. If you're rich, you get to go home to your family, bring back money, whatever it is. I got to go home once. So there's a little carrot, but lots of sticks. You know that expression. You have that expression here? Yeah, okay. And they will put you through tests and crises. They will manufacture tests to put you through. So, for example, when people joined the Unification Church, one of the first things they had to do was call their families and disconnect from them. And they would have to sit in a room with another Unification Church member, or Mooney as they were called, sitting next to you, making sure that's what you did. And that was like your first test, if you were going to do that. Every time you go through a test and you pass the test, you choose for the group, they own one little bit more of you, right? It's one more thing you're giving up. And so then eventually you have an induced dependency. This is another thing that happens. People get out of cults, and a lot of times many therapists don't have a clue how to work with former cult members, which is why one of the things we do at our nonprofit is CE courses for therapists, because we need more therapists who can help people. And people will say, oh, well, you're a dependent personality, that's why you got in the cult. No, you didn't start out. I was not a dependent. I was like assertive, been around the world, rebel, tomboy, all those things. But the dependency gets induced, and that's what people need to understand. And that is part of what then becomes this sense of responsibility or sense of accountability, and how much is it you, or how much is it this other person that they've created. This is me, by the way, leading a demonstration. I don't know if you can see that. I had long hair then. I was supposed to look like a girl. Anyway, one of the hardest things for me when I first joined, I had just kind of come out as a lesbian, and I had this great, and actually most of the early recruits into our group were lesbians, which was kind of ironic, but anyway. And I had this great t-shirt, like a man's kind of t-shirt, and it said Super Dyke, like Superwoman, but it was like Super Dyke. And I had to when I joined, they said, you have to get rid of that t-shirt. I was like, oh my God. But I did. I wish I had kept it hidden somewhere. I'd love to still have that t-shirt, but anyway. Let's see. Okay, so step 5 is you become enmeshed in this self-sealing system. And so what that means is, it's very broken down very simply. The leader has all the truth. You're now part of an elite with special knowledge, and that's part of the attraction, and that's part of where the us versus them mentality comes in. You have to deny yourself to be fully part of the group. Members are to blame for whatever goes wrong. The leader is responsible, of course, for whatever goes right, and everything else is evil. Very simple. That's it in a nutshell. And you think this has to be, very few groups. It's just thousands of groups, thousands. I've been doing this for 35 years. I can't tell you how busy I am. I have never been busier since I retired from university. But even all those years I did this work, every day I learn of a new group. I hear horror story after horror story. The amount of sexual abuse of children is so rampant, it's shocking. It's incredible. And it's why I do what I do. It's like whatever I can do to bring awareness to this, to help the survivors, to help the kids who are born in, who are coming out. I call it actually the kids coming out of cults, and they're not kids when they come out. They're maybe 17, 18, 25, 30, whatever. Their whole life was in a cult. They get out. Sometimes they don't know their real name. They don't have birth certificates. They have no clue if they have any relatives anywhere else in the world who they could go to. They get no social services, at least in the United States. They could go to a domestic violence shelter and they'd get turned away, like they don't qualify. They end up on the streets. They end up on drugs. They end up selling themselves for sex because they don't know what else to do. They don't know how to get an education. They don't know anything about what we call a GED, which is an equivalent of having graduated from high school. It's a test you take, because most cults homeschool. And homeschooling, and I'm probably rare, I don't know if do you have homeschooling here? In America, we have homeschooling, which is a joke. Anybody can say, I'm going to teach my children. These are people who probably hardly graduated themselves. They're suddenly going to teach their children. But in the cults, what happens is all they're teaching them is the leader's words, right? They listen to the lectures of the leader. The leader's pictures are all over the walls. In some places, they get absolutely no education at all, but they're just told that they homeschool, right? There's no supervision of it, very, very little in the United States. So these kids come out, they have no education. Depending on the cult, they may not even know how to really speak English. They have nowhere to go. And I call it America's biggest public health issue that's completely unrecognized, because there are literally thousands of these kids. The most population that's coming to us now at the nonprofit are people who were born and raised in the cult. It's huge. And their issues are quite different from people like me who joined as an adult, as you can imagine, because they don't go through the normal developmental processes that the rest of us go through in, quote, regular society, right? So everything about them is completely shaped. You know, my buddy Renan here, who works with me at the nonprofit, who lives here, he was born in a cult. So he can tell you, talk to him at lunchtime or whatever. It's not pretty for the kids. So anyway, this is the system. So the deployable agent, that was the goal, I said. This is, who knows who this is? Yes?
Patty Hearst.
Patty Hearst, you're American. Yeah. That's Patty Hearst. You remember Patty Hearst? So she was recruited by a group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was a radical leftist group back in the 70s, and she was the daughter of Randolph Hearst, who owned the big newspaper empire. And they locked her in a closet for 6 weeks, read Marx and Lenin and all that stuff to her, and talked to her, and went in the closet and raped her and did all this stuff to her. She came out of the closet 6 weeks later, called herself Tanya, and they went around robbing banks. And during one of the bank robberies, they eventually got caught. During one of the bank robberies, a woman got killed, and I think a bank guard got killed. So she did eventually go to prison, even though she wasn't the one who shot them, but she was in that particular bank robbery. And then she got pardoned by one of our presidents. So the deployable agent is basically the true believer who will, like a Marine, will do anything without question. Even if you have questions, again, of course you don't ask, just like in the Marines, right? You do it later. But in the Marines, presumably, there's a chain of command, and you can go to someone above and say, hey, my sergeant did X, Y, or Z. I mean, we know that's not a perfect system, just like the Catholic Church wasn't a perfect system for the child abuse, but there should be some levels of accountability, which doesn't happen in a cult. It's not democratic, right? There's no way to hold anyone accountable at the upper levels. So the question is, someone like this, or someone like me, and someone else's story I'll tell you later, should we hold them accountable for their actions? You know, what their beliefs were influenced, coercively influenced? Are they responsible for that as much as they loved it at the time? Like how do we deal like that? Do we hold some of them accountable and not others? You know, our second in command, she was a bitch from hell. She loved it. You know, most people in the group who change, like I became really mean. I hated it. At the time, I thought I was doing the right thing, but when I got out, I was like, God forbid, what did I do? But there's other people, you know, other little budding psychopaths who do end up in these groups, who aspire to leadership. They enjoy it. So how do we determine that? Who's responsible and who isn't? Or are we all responsible? So, okay, what's next? Oh yeah, so once you're in this system, you're basically, your decisions become constrained by this system. Both all of this, which works together, these are all interlocking, they're not four separate things. So you have all these internalized sanctions and punishments and way of keeping you in line, but you also, in your mind at least, believe there will be external sanctions. Most people are told if you leave the group, you'll die. We were told, oh, if you leave the group, you'll die in the gutter, dirty communists. You know, Americans hate communists. No one's going to like you. You might as well stay with us. there's always some threat, make you paranoid. There's all this us versus them. So together, you're stuck in this system, and the choices you get to make, at least the consequential choices. You might have choices like what to eat for breakfast or, things like that, of no consequence. But big choices like, how do I get out of here? Or can I challenge the leader? You don't get to do that. And you know very quickly that you don't get to do that. So these are Heaven's Gate. I don't have to ask you what Heaven's Gate was? Everybody. Okay. So that was the cult that stopped waiting for the spaceship. They'd been together like 25 years, living in complete isolation. Most of the people in the group had been in from the beginning. My opinion, I knew a lot about them. I worked with a lot of people who'd been in for a long time. My opinion was that they were just sick and tired of waiting. They all had always said, we're never going to commit suicide, we're never going to commit suicide. And then at the end it became, suicide is staying here, right? Suicide is staying here. To live is to leave. So that's how they rationalized it. So we had, 40, or in the end 40, I think 41 people, a couple people took their lives afterwards who committed suicide, which many of the parents never recognized as suicide, but considered it murder. It's a complicated story because the leader at the time, the male leader, he was actually, the female leader was actually the leader, but she had died. And so he took over. They had to kind of convince him to take over. She recruited him, and she was his cult leader. And I think most people think it was all him because he was there at the end. But in fact, in many ways, he was also a victim. And I know a lot of people don't like me to say that, but I do believe that's true from all the work I did. So, again, we have the conceptual framework of these four interlocking dimensions of both structure and process: the charismatic authority, the transcendent belief system, the systems of control, the systems of influence. And to talk a little bit about charismatic authority. Okay, who's that? Y'all should know this one. He had ashrams here.
Osho?
Who?
Is it
Osho,
Osho?
Rajneesh, Bhagwan Rajneesh. He had a big ashram in Pune, India, but he had places all around other European countries, and then went to Oregon in America and finally got chased out of America. This is him doing what he was known for, his special whatever. Actually, our other friend here who we're seeing tomorrow was one of the kids in this group, and the kids were horrifically abused. It's only just come out because they never talked. But Rajneesh hated kids, and so he separated the kids. He told the women not to have children, and most of the women were told to get sterilized. Like this woman here, who got recruited when she was 23, she got sterilized at 24. So the women got sterilized so they couldn't have babies, but the ones who came with babies, with children, they were separated and they lived together. And sometimes they were even sent to other countries. They were never around their parents. And, Rajneesh was all about free love, free sex. So starting at age 7, the girls were told to be provocative, learn how to be sexy. And they lived in these like dorms. They had a little like index card box with their name on it. And any guy could come by and write his name and say, this is whatever his Indian name was, his chosen, the name Osho gave him. This is so-and-so, I'm coming by at 9 to see you. And they'd come and have sex with these 7-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 11-year-olds. And if they didn't have enough names on their card, they were criticized for not being free and open enough. little girls. And they had orgies, they had adult orgies, and the kids had to go to the orgies and hand out the condoms and clean up the mess. So it was, people think Osho, you know, you probably see on the internet, I don't know, at least in America, people post these Osho quotes, you know, these stupid, benign, idiotic, pablum happiness quotes from Osho. Have no idea who this man really was. This woman was sexually abused by him for years. She was his so-called secret lover. He'd have sex with her and he'd strangle her while he was having sex with her. So he was not a nice man. It's kind of your typical guru, really. So charismatic authority is this person who supposedly is charismatic, which again is a very tricky thing. Most people think charisma is something you're born with, right? It's a trait in you, but in fact, as Max Weber, the great sociologist, says, charisma is a social relationship. So it's you who grants charisma to that person. You're the one who deems that person charismatic. That's why some people could think John Kennedy was charismatic and others, or Trump, God forbid, and others would go, huh? You know. So charisma's in the eye of the beholder. But once you do that, once you give that person that characteristic, then they have power over you. It's a relationship with an imbalance of power. And that's the seed of this person leading and building and forming this organization. So, the Transcendent belief system, as I said, it's the visionary component, it's the ideology, but it's also the organizational component. Out of the belief system comes the methodology. So, I know a lot of this is about extreme beliefs, and when I talk about cults, because a lot of times those of us who do this work, we're criticized for being anti-religion. And I'm like, I'm not anti-religion. I mean, I'm not religious. I don't care if you're religious. I don't care what you believe in. What I look at is the behavior, right? I don't care how extreme the beliefs are if the behavior of the group is okay. If it's an extreme belief, it's probably not going to be, but it's not a given. So this is a very important part, that the methodology comes out of the belief system, because what you end up with is the end justifies the means philosophy. Once you have an end justifies the means philosophy, anything goes. You can be asked to do anything. Rob a bank, kill somebody, leave your family, do whatever, because it's for the greater goal, the greater good, right? Supposedly. So I always tell people, if you join something and it's an end justifies the means philosophy, run like hell. Get out of there, because it's going to end up no good. Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about the systems of control. This is the discipline and the subjugation of the person. In my group, we called it freedom and necessity. In order to have freedom, you had to have the necessity of discipline and hard work. And this came from Chairman Mao, who we adored, and this was our slogan, right? The revolution isn't a tea party, right? And it will not be easy for you or anyone. That's what you accept. So once you accept that, how can you complain? They'll say, remember, the revolution isn't a tea party. Shut up and get to work. No, you don't get Sunday off. No, you don't get to go back to Wisconsin and see your family. No, you don't get to go to your mother's funeral. No. Freedom and necessity. So that's really one of the hooks. And then the systems of influence. So here's T and Do from Heaven's Gate. You know, they were just another mom and dad. Sweet little couple. He was very handsome, very charismatic, deep blue eyes, was an actor, a singer. She was like the mom, but she was also into theosophy and did seances and all of that stuff before she even met him. So she brought that part of it. So as I said earlier, you have the subtle social psychological manipulation, sometimes not so subtle, but they don't have to beat you, although in many groups they do beat you. And then the idea is self-renunciation, rejecting yourself, becoming this new person with these new beliefs. Then you have the charismatic commitment or the charismatic community. This again is Rajneesh. They were all red, if you remember. So once you're in that, this is bliss. They were in bliss. They didn't have to do drugs. They had so much music, so much chanting, so much singing, so much crazy shit going on all the time. They were just in a constant trance state, right? And we know when you're in this state, you're far more vulnerable. So of course you think, whatever you experience at that time, like this incredible vision or whatever, you attribute that to Osho. Osho did that. And I say to them, no, Osho didn't do it. You did that. You created that. It's like dropping LSD. You drop LSD. I saw Sgt. Pepper's Band walk through my living room. Who's going to tell me I didn't? I created that. Rajneesh didn't. So you have to just break it down in the simplest terms for people. These guys don't do bupkis. They're very lazy cult leaders, actually. You're there to wait on them. They're not there to take care of you. So in the end, we have what, I don't know if you know Robert Lifton's work. If not, you should. Robert J. Lifton, American psychohistorian. He wrote a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. It's the book that saved my life. Because when I got out of the cult in the mid-'80s, all anybody talked about were religious cults. And, well, of course we weren't religious. And I'm like, well, wait a minute, maybe we weren't a cult. And so I'd make a list. I'd say, okay, they had Jesus, we had Marx. They had the Bible, we had the training of the cadre. They had this, we had that. And I said, okay, we're a cult. But Lifton studied communist China, which is what we were modeled after. So when I read his book, it was like, oh, thank God, somebody understands this. Because it's exactly what we did. Most of the time we sat around in circles criticizing someone to get rid of your bourgeois tendencies and all the black and white thinking. I'll tell you one of my stories. I have time?
Max 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes, okay. Oh, no, I'm not going to tell you that story. Because I want to tell you about Nishika. So anyway, he used this term personal closure, which basically the individualized version of the larger self system. The person becomes, in a sense, the devotee becomes like a microcosm of the cult. And that's that internalization I talked about earlier. You completely internalize. And your perspective and decision making are limited and constrained as much from within as without. And your free will, and this is the sticky wicket about free will, which God knows, I think people don't even know what free will is, really. But free will is altered by the will of the cult. And your sense of morality becomes the immorality of the cult leader. And that's the crux. And that, for me, is where the responsibility either comes in or doesn't. When I go to court as an expert witness, these are the things I try to explain when I'm trying to get someone's sentence mitigated. So, this is Nishika. Nishika was recruited, she lived in Georgia. She was in her mid-20s, I think. She got recruited over the phone by a cult in South Carolina. They eventually convinced her to move there. She had 2 little girls, young girls. She moved there, they put them through a cleansing and potions and God knows what. And they were the leaders were from Haiti, so they were kind of a voodoo mix of mishmash of stuff. So there were maybe 8 or 10 people in this group. And they got evicted from their apartments. So they got in their cars and they drove for like a year. They drove around the country in their cars. And eventually the female, whose name was Seus or something, she basically overthrew her husband and she became the leader. And she always hated Nishika's kids. And she had her own kid, but she always hated Nishika's 2 little girls. So when they were in Colorado, they were at a gas station. And they met this guy who Seuss decided was Saint Michael. And he said, oh, well, that's cool. And he said, you know, if you want, you can come live on my farm. He had a marijuana farm. And he said, I've got lots of land, you can come live on my farm. So they went and lived on his farm in tents or whatever and parked their cars. And nobody could leave the farm. Only he would go to town and buy food, come back, and she rationed their food, and she was really strict, and supposedly, you know, the end was coming. And one day she decided Nashika's kids had been whores in their other life, and that they were spreading bad juju onto everyone else. And so she banished the two girls. They were like 4 and 6, I think. She had them locked in a car. It's July. They were locked in a car. No one was allowed to bring them food or water. And in August, the owner of the farm had gone into town with his dog, and his dog was completely emaciated because she wouldn't let the dog eat. And his old friends saw him, and they saw the dog, and they thought, he would never let his dog get like that. There's something wrong. So they called his father, and his father came from Texas. And his father went to the ranch. He saw the car, opened the car. 2 girls were dead. He called the police. But the night before, Seuss, by then there were only like 5 of them. Seuss, the night before, said, this is the night that they're coming to get us. We're going to move over to this part of the farm. And she told Nashika to leave, like, just get the hell out of there. And Nashika was pregnant because she had her sleep with the guy who owned the farm. So Nashika left. She walked, I don't know how many miles to town. She thought they were going to be lifted up. She's sitting in a cafe the next day, and the TV is on, and she sees the place being raided. And they're all still there, and she's like, what the fuck? I'm sorry. She's like, what the hell? They were supposed to be lifted up last night, right? So she suddenly thinks, wait, maybe this was all just a joke. So she turned herself in, and she got charged with double murder. Her daughters were dead of malnutrition and dehydration. Their bodies were so decomposed that they couldn't even really do an autopsy and determine the actual cause of death. So she was charged with double murder of 2 children, first-degree murder, and she was facing life without parole. And the cult leader was also charged, the husband, one of the other, and then the other members kind of gave evidence, so they weren't given sentences. So I got contacted by the public defender to come and try to explain to the jury why she wouldn't have tried to rescue her children, like how that would have been impossible for her to do. So we were trying to get her life with parole. She's like, at this point, 30-some years old. Didn't work. It's the only case I've done that didn't work. And she got life with parole. And she's now in prison. And about a year later, she wrote me a letter and sent me this picture. And when she left the courtroom that day and she hugged me and, you know, said thank you, and I said, I'm so sorry. And I said to the attorneys, make sure she gets Take Back Your Life, my recovery book. So a year later, I get a letter from her. My hands were just shaking as I read the letter. And she said, she thanked me for being there for her. She said, I feel like you were the only person who understood me. Your book has saved my life. I completely understand now what happened to me and my children. And she's like working with other women in the prison and asked me if I could send more books to the prison library. And she said, I know I'm in here forever, but whatever I can do to help, I want to do. And I mean, I just cried and cried and cried. I was like, oh my God. So that's why I do what I do. And unfortunately, I couldn't really help Nashika, at least with her sentence. So that's it for me. Any questions? Thank you.